Okay, so I am delighted to be hosting you all for this regenerative grains discussion, part of a series of conversations we'll be hosting with farmers, millers, and bakers at Class Climate Farm School at Terra.do. And I'm particularly excited for the panelists that we have joining us today because they've been such wonderful resources and friends and community members of Climate Farm School for the past, year plus now, and have so much to share when it comes to the how and the kind of continued transformation towards regenerative regional grain ecosystems. How to do that today will focus on practices on the land that they are all deeply immersed in understanding and improving. And we all know that starts with the health of the soil and moving on up through the ecosystem. And then we'll continue to have conversations on this topic next week with Kevin Morse from Cairn Spring Mills, focusing more on the milling and processing side of enabling regenerative grains. And hopefully a few more conversations will play out in the early 2024 midwinter. So yeah, definitely let us know what topics or speakers or areas of interest you have within this broad field of regenerative grains. Broad being kind of a, I don't know, conceptual academic word right now, but I just want to also emphasize that this method of grain production, while it might be ancient or have a lot of history behind it, it is not the way that we commonly grow grains in this country or most other countries in the world right now. So in that sense, it is very unconventional in current farming practices. And so it's a real learning opportunity to have farmers who are experimenting and innovating with these practices today without the same level of resources and support as the larger scale industrial farming system. It's a huge privilege to have people here who are working through these challenges to share with us, answer our questions, and be in community with sort of asking ourselves how we can make these systems that we know are good for soil health and good for human health more common in more places, so it doesn't feel like just a niche thing that it takes XYZ, like very specific set of resources and like constellations of support in order to make it happen. So definitely want to share a lot of gratitude for our panelists who are here today. We have Robin Morgan from the Bread Lab at WSU up in Western Washington, and Jay Goldmark from Stonehouse Grain in the Hudson Valley. I don't know if Elizabeth has joined us yet or if she will be joining us momentarily, but if she does appear, we'll be really excited to welcome and hear from her. With Honore Farm and Mill here in Northern California in Sonoma and Marin counties, where she's growing and processing grains. And Kevin and Robin from Branchwater Farms, also in the Hudson Valley, are here. And thank you so much for being with us. So the format for our discussion today is going to be just to pass it off to each of our panelists to share a little bit more in 5 minutes or so about their operations, what grains they're growing, what challenges they're confronting in the fields, and kind of opening up to how other parts of the food supply chain can help and support what they're doing, or how they're connecting across the food supply chain currently to get their grains into the hands of millers, bakers, et cetera, further along the chain. And then we'll open it up for a general discussion with everyone who's here and kind of be thinking about this deeper embedded question of how can we, as potentially non-farmers or other diverse climate professionals in the Climate Farm School community, lend support to ideas or activities that need to happen to support regenerative grains while keeping farmers at the center of those ideas. How can we follow up on actions or projects that we might have in mind while kind of respecting farmers' times, learning from farmers, and being connected to the land, or maintaining a connection to the land, which I think is the essential piece of what we're trying to instill at Climate Farm School. So yes, with that, I will turn it over to each of our panelists, and I have a few photos that I'll just kind of scroll through that illustrate some of what they're talking about. But if you have a specific photo that you want me to move to, just let me know, Robin, Jay, and Kevin and Robin. And Robin, we'll start with you. So over to you to expand on what you're up to with regenerative grains.
Okay, fantastic. So My name is Robin Morgan, and I'm a PhD student at the Washington State University Bread Lab. And we are in particular located west, like north of Seattle, about 60 miles north, so Western Washington State. And it's a laboratory that develops grain varieties, in particular wheat, barley, and rye varieties for this part of the nation, so the maritime Pacific Northwest. And we through these plant breeding activities, we aim at addressing both, let's say, agronomic and human nutrition issues that are involved in grain production and grain consumption. So this slide, for example, here in particular, presents one of the crucial issues that we address with our work, which is developing grain varieties that are going to be used as whole grain, because in today's, let's say, dietary landscape in North America, dietary fiber is a component that is like severely lacking in the vast majority of people's diet. Hence, we developed, for example, wheat varieties that can be utilized as a whole grain without having to renounce to the technological functionality or flavor, for example, so they can be enjoyable too. On the agronomic side, so if you could move one slide, it would be great. We also, let's say, this is another aspect of the work we do. We also work with unusual type of wheat. So usually wheat is red or white, but actually the biological variation that exists can be much more than that. So we can have purple, blue, and black wheat. And besides those looking very appealing and interesting, are also valuable from a nutritional perspective. So we can present numerous phytochemicals ranging from polyphenols and vitamins of different kinds that can actually contribute in a positive manner to human health. So if you move one slide again, so this instead on the agronomic side, the main focus of my work here at the Bread Lab for the last 5 years has been working on the development of a perennial wheat crop. So rather than having a plant that usually the way wheat is grown is like, let's say, winter wheat is planted here in October, and then it's harvested in July or August, depending on the exact area and the season. So we can also develop a perennial grain crop that is a combination of domesticated wheat and a perennial grass called wheatgrass. So in this slide, you can see on the left hand a plot. So in this case, this is our organic nursery here in Western Washington, and this is just about 2 months after harvest. So we are in November, and on the left side of the picture, you see a plot of a perennial breeding line that is actually regrowing, just as it was planted almost a year and a half before. And on the right hand side, instead, you see an annual line, a breeding line that is not regrowing as it's supposed to. So this is a way that we think we can further enable, like the development of cropping system that can overcome some of the negative externalities that are involved in grain production. So focusing on soil health and at the same time also public health too. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Robin. That is great to hear an overview of what you're up to. And I feel like there will be many good questions about the perennial wheat research that you're doing. But yeah, just to keep things moving along, I'm going to pass it over to Jay to introduce what you are up to at Stonehouse Grain.
All right, thank you, Lainey, and thanks, Robin, for the perennial wheat presentation. Please send me enough to plant 1,000 acres. That sounds like the way to go. So I'm the farm manager here at Stonehouse Grain.
Jay, we lost your sound for a second.
Oh, shoot. Can you hear me? I have to speak right into my laptop, I think. Is this okay?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
That's better.
Awesome.
Okay, cool. Please tell me if that happens again. So Stonehouse Grain is about a 2,000 acre organic farm in Hudson, New York, which is about a 2 hour drive north of Manhattan in the beautiful Hudson Valley. So across 2,000 acres, we're balancing this organic grain rotation with livestock in a diverse suite of cash crops and cover crops. You see here, we grow everything from corn, soybeans, wheat, rye, barley, sunflowers, flax. You get the idea. And the challenge with a diverse crop rotation like this is really just how to manage timing. Time becomes the real scarcity. But we need these diverse crops because we're not relying on synthetic nitrogen, of course. We're building all of our nutrients through green manure and the nutrient recycling that comes from grazing. And more on the grazing part later. But for the most part, we're 1,500 acres of grains. And our main crops are the corn, soybeans, and peas, and a small grain like wheat or barley. And all those grains we use to supply an on-farm animal feed mill. And we mill up layer feed and sheep and goat feed and hog feed and sell that mostly all within 100 miles into the community of other small livestock farmers that are raising, pastured pork and poultry. So in that sense, it's a really unique business model because we're behaving very much almost like a vegetable CSA farm, where we're at scale. We're fairly, we're large for a vegetable farm, but actually kind of small for a big grain farm in Midwest standards. So everything we grow, we try and get the highest value for with the organic premium. And then by making the feed, that's value added. And everything becomes kind of sold per pound as it leaves the farm, or we sell it out of our feed store on the farm in 50-pound bags. So that's another way that we're able to become financially sustainable, is through adding value to those grains from the field all the way through the store. So that's a little bit about the theory of the business, but it really all starts with healthy soil. What's in the next slide, Lainey? What else did I share with you? Okay, cool. This is just kind of like an overview of the farm. All these little different colors are kind of how we conceptualize the crop rotation and the stages of how wherever we grow corn, for instance, that's the yellow blocks. The next year, those same blocks are going to be a legume. So they'll be either peas or soybeans. And then after a legume rotation, after harvest, say in the fall, we want to get our small grains in. And then that's in year 3, and we'll undersow the small grains with perennial red clover to build nitrogen and nutrients again for hay. And then we'll go back into our big grain rotation, eventually back into corn. And there's all these cool variations that you can do off that fairly boring 4-year rotation, but that's the form. And then just like with jazz music or anything else, you can improvise and come back to the head or come back to the beginning to get the melody. But that 4-year rotation of corn, soybeans or peas, and small grains, wheat, barley, undersown with perennials, or into warm season cover crops, and then eventually back into a big grain crop because we need the cash flow. That's the basic theory of that rotation as well, so we can supply the feed mill that we run on the farm. What else did I send you, Lane? Oh yeah, here are just some cool pictures for what the fields look like in midsummer and in the fall. That upper left photo, those are yellow peas. I'm really excited about growing peas because they're a great legume, of course, that we'll use following corn. They're a cool season, which means we can harvest them. You can see that picture of that swather in the top middle. We like to swath them when they're still green so we don't shatter the peas. And then we put them in those windrows, which are those cool rusty contour lines. And then we'll use a pickup head on a combine. And it's a great addition to our crop rotation because all of a sudden we have a field that's been harvested in mid-July, and then we can grow a cover crop there, where normally if it was soybeans take all year to grow, or you really can't plant them until the soil temps are 50 degrees, and that's May. And then we harvest them in late October. So that's kind of the whole growing season for one crop. And that's not a whole lot of photosynthesis that's happening there, or soil building. But peas in the rotation, we plant them really early, like in late March or early April, as soon as we can get on the land. And then, of course, we harvest them mid-July, and then we can grow a diverse warm season cover crop mix. I think that might be in the next photo, Lainey. Yeah, these warm seasons are really cool, like sorghum Sudan and millet and cowpeas and radish, buckwheat. There's maybe sun hemp in there too. In our growing zone, we get a lot of water and a lot of heat in July and August, and they just explode. And it's just great to break up compaction and recycle nutrients, and it's great for grazing too. So, adding that's been one area we're really trying to heal the soil after growing some big grain crops that pull a lot of nutrients from the soil. And because Robin hasn't sent us that perennial wheat yet, it involves still a fair amount of cultivation to grow those organic grain crops. So those warm season crops are going to add a lot of organic matter back to the soil, and help break up some compaction that our heavy equipment has created. So that's a little bit of what we're working on right now. There's a lot more to share, but I think that's a good crash course.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jay. And I think this was the last of the things that you sent me. I think it's just a few more illustrative images. But yeah, if you want to just touch on the no-till soybeans coming up, what is that about?
Oh yeah. So with organic grain farming, there's always a lot of tension between tillage and cultivation to control weeds, which are really the biggest economic factor in a successful organic grain crop, or like getting no-till to work, where you're able to grow a cover crop. In this case, we grow cereal rye the previous fall, and in that bottom right picture, second to the left, you just see these little lines, these little green lines coming up through rolled and crimped rye. The rye is like a silvery mat. So we're creating like black plastic with a green cover crop that then gets rolled and crimped and laid flat. And then we no-till plant the soybeans into that mat of rye, and soybeans do a really good job of emerging and coming up. And then you can see in the very bottom right corner, there's a little bit of weeds coming through the mat, but the soybeans are nice and bushy, and they're going to win this race. They're going to canopy out, and we actually had a great soybean crop there with absolutely no tillage required, except for preparing the seed bed the previous fall for the cereal rye crop. So those kinds of strategies really help when you have a lot of acres to have, your base acres, still are cultivated, but we always try and have 100 or 200 acres of no-till cropping as well, which just helps with labor, and it also is nice to have that rotation come around eventually to all the fields, so it gets the benefit of zero tillage.
Amazing. Thanks for sharing about that. And we can come back to any further questions about tillage and reducing tillage or moving towards no-till if people have that. And I think folks are already taking advantage of the Q&A feature, but feel free to put more questions in there for us to come back to. And since I don't think we have Elizabeth with us, I'll just kind of skip this slide for now and just narrate a little bit that this is Tristan, who was contract farming for Elizabeth to grow Pirani heirloom organic wheat at Green Valley Farm and Mill, which is where I live and I'm speaking to you all from. And so, he grew a couple acres here. It's part of a diversified grain operation that Elizabeth manages. And there's some cool things happening that I'll be excited to share more about when we have Elizabeth join us for one of these calls. I think specifically about getting the grains into the regional food system. And there's a cool partnership happening with Sebastopol City Schools here in Sonoma County, where they're milling and serving Sonoma County grown grains to school students, which is kind of like mind-blowing and earth-shattering from my perspective, studying farm to school programs for a little while and just realizing how hard it is to get local food into schools a lot of the times. And so it's very very impressive, and we'll get Elizabeth to tell us more about that when we can connect with her. So yes, and with that, I'll pass it over to Kevin and Robin to share a little bit more about what they're doing, how they're doing it at Branchwater Farms in the Hudson Valley.
Okay, good afternoon. So we're a husband and wife team on a fairly small family farm. It's the entire size of the farm is 100 acres, but we only have about 25 acres in fields. The rest is forest and swamp, and there's a water system that runs through the farm as well. And we focus on small grains, rye and wheat, that we use entirely here on the farm. So we don't sell anything. Everything that we grow, we use in our distillery. So all the wheat is used for our gin production and whiskey production, and all the rye is used for rye whiskey production. And we do some similar things to what Jay does, but Jay has a much larger system and more fields to kind of move things around in. We don't grow corn. We did corn one year, but we probably won't ever do it again. And that's mostly because of just equipment and not having the equipment to do it the proper way. So we really focus on our no-till drill seeder and just do the really small grains. We do till in September, October to plant the rye and the wheat. And then we come in March, hopefully on a frozen day when the soil is still frozen, and we overseed with red clover and allow the thawing and the freezing of the soil to sow that red clover down into the seed bed. That helps bring in some nitrogen to help feed the cereal crops. And it also forms a little bit of a carpet on the seed bed to suppress the weeds. And that system has worked fairly well for us over the years. And then we harvest in July. It's a wet, the Hudson Valley is a pretty humid area. So we try to harvest in July, and then we move the animals into the fields after we're done with that harvest. So they eat the grain that has fallen off, and they eat the red clover, and they eat anything else that's growing at that time. The animals, Robin does all the animals, so they do the fertilization for us, and
there they are.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we move them off and then start all over again. So that's our typical rotation. We've started to do something new this year where we're going to take 1/3 of all the acres out of production for a year. So 6 acres are out this year. We have all the animals in that field for the winter. In the springtime, we'll plant buckwheat and oats and red clover and daikon, and we'll just keep planting as much of a salad as we possibly can, which will be a green manure that will then roller crimp down, and then prepare the fields for the fall planting of the cereal grains again.
Amazing. Thank you for that overview, Kevin. And I have just a few more beautiful photos to share of Branchwater.
That's rye by the barn. And then the top right, that's our wheat harvest. That's the wheat in the main field, and then rye again on the lower right.
I think it's the last one. Amazing. Okay, great. Well, so now that we have heard from each of our amazing panelists, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and bring it back into conversation mode here. Great. Okay, well, so yeah, we have about half the time to just dig into some questions here from all of you. And I think my first question that I would just like to kick things off with, and maybe pass it over to each one of you, Robin, Jay, and Robin and Kevin, is how, so I feel like we have conversations at Climate Farm School about enabling a regenerative grain ecosystem and, you know, providing more milling services that are appropriate scales, or providing markets for some of the crops in your cropping rotations that might not have a market yet. But how would you all say is kind of the best way for people working like in different parts of the food supply chain to carry forward ideas that help benefit regenerative grain systems, while kind of keeping the farming realities and perspectives at the center? And I guess I'm thinking that like farmers and other parts of the food supply chain like shouldn't be as disconnected as they are, but can be often very disconnected. So like, how do we, you know, do you have to just have a new farmer best friend, or like what's the way that you all are working with other people in different parts of the food chain? And anyone can start.
Yeah, maybe I can go first if it's okay. Yeah, so not being directly like the bread lab itself is not necessarily like a farm, but we definitely work with farmers and millers and bakers and all the mentioned grain users, no? Like, and so our approach has been to work at all the different levels, no? Because when we think about breeding and new kinds of wheat, we have to think about all the people that are involved in it, no? So we need to think about wheat as a plant, and so it has to work in a certain context, and wheat as flour, no? For example, or in the distilling case for spirit production. So all of these different uses, and so we need to have all these conversations with the relevant people. What we have been doing, we have been working also at different scales. So we've been working with farms in this region, the Olympic Peninsula, or in the Skagit Valley, that have started to integrate different aspects of the wheat food chain into their own operation. And so we have wheat farms that now have their own flour mill or even their own bakery now, and they have found a way to further retain, you know, the value that they produce in the field, and further enable them to promote what they're doing differently from other situations and other cases. So that's the most direct way that we have been working on. But at the same time, we've also been working with a bigger actor in the industry, such as King Arthur Flour, the baking company that is based out of Vermont, and they've just released a new whole wheat flour called the Climate Blend that was developed in collaboration with the Bread Lab, and they are supporting the development and growth of regenerative grains from an end-use perspective. So trying to inform bakers and overall flour people that are interested in using flour in what could be the difference between a regenerative grain or not. Yeah, for example, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing your take on that, Robin. And before we move on, I just want to kind of ask or clarify, like, are any of these conversations that you're having, like, you know, related to the end use uptake of a regenerative grain or a grain that's not, you know, sprayed with tons of pesticides? Like, is it like a human health angle that you're taking in some of the conversations, or is it like climate angle, or is it kind of both?
So it has to be both. It kind of depending on the specific interest, we have to kind of tailor now the conversation. Maybe like farmers might be more interested in soil health, and a baker might be more interested in flavor, but they all are interested in the whole picture at the same time, no? So depending on the specific context, it's important to emphasize different aspects of it as well. Yeah.
Totally. I love that. It's both. Cool. Jay, and then we'll go over to Kevin and Robin.
Yeah, so I hadn't really thought about this until your question, Lainey, but it's a good one. So I think on my own, I'm like, what is the market for everything I grow? It's because we run the on-farm feed mill, I'm also buying the grain from myself, essentially.
Mhm.
Kind of, I think how maybe Robin and Kevin grow everything for themselves too. So I don't think I'd grow corn if I wasn't running a feed mill. But because the feed mill is a really important part of our farm's mission to supply organic feed to the community, to be this foundation of the organic
Oh, we
farming
lost your audio
community.
again.
Oh, shoot, sorry.
No, it's back.
I'm gonna get real up close and personal.
Oh,
Um,
now it's not.
because organic feed is so important to supply into our community, we need to grow, the corn and the soybeans. If feed wasn't part of our mission, I think I'd be more excited about growing other grains in a diverse rotation, like food grade wheat and even distillers grains. But I think there's healthier grains to grow that don't pull so many nutrients from the soil. But before I get too far down that road, I think um, having a market is just so important for a farmer to know how to manage their land. Um, being financially sustainable is really important for any farm. So if the farmer can figure out how to do the things they love to do on their land and make money, or at least not lose money while doing it, that's a great year for most farms. Um, so if that means growing fava beans or dry beans or mung beans or wheat or barley or hemp or grass-fed beef, it's like really it's so personal. It's what farmer loves to do, is what eventually they're probably going to do anyway. But I think they can be nudged significantly by a market. Um, and a lot of the times it's just having someone approach them and say, hey, have you thought about growing this? Here's a contract. Do you think are these terms amenable? And I think farmers are really innovative, and they respond to really anything that's going to help them and their soils out.
Amazing. Love that. Kevin and Robin.
Well, I think, well, we're customers of Jay for the organic feed for the ducks and the chickens. But I think one of the most important things is the value added aspect of what you grow. So for us, with 25 acres of fields, it would be impossible to make a living on that small a plot of land, no matter how many animals we had, to add to that income stream. So to have to convert the grain into whiskey, gin, etc., and charge more money for it is what enables all that possible for us. And then I think the other thing is that the community here in the Hudson Valley is extremely receptive to organic growing products that come from the farm.
There's a very active community that supports CSAs. It's a rural based society in many of the towns. So there's a connection already to the land and what's grown on it. And I think that's probably the hardest part for a lot of communities, is that education of where things come from.
Yeah. And then as far as what we do, I think that's more, the animals I think have more of an impact there than the grains. The grains, we need wheat and rye for the distillation, but the animals are more about how they integrate with the regenerative process, but also what the market wants. So the Hudson Valley is known for ducks. There's not many duck farmers in this area where we happen to be. So that became kind of a niche that Robin took on, and then finding a market for duck eggs has sometimes been challenging. We've donated several duck eggs to the food shelters on occasion when we have more than we can sell. But yeah, I think it's finding what the market will want and what influences what we'll do. I keep pushing Robin to bring pigs into our rotation because we produce so much spent mash in the distillery that's a natural food for the pig, and since we have a lot of forest here, it's an easy place for them to be rummaging around for acorns, etc., and then supplementing with the spent mash. So I mean that's an idea that we're working on for the future probably.
Cool. Yeah. So it sounds like you guys are a lot of you playing your own role as your own customers, but yeah, looking for more market collaborations and signals to allow expansion or diversification to other aspects of a grain system. So we have a bunch of questions that have come in here from the Q&A. Thank you all for putting them in there. And I'll try and get through a bunch of these. And then I also encourage folks to just like raise your hand and ask your questions live, because we're a relatively small group. It's nice to hear a diversity of voices. So let's see. One question that I just want to bring in is, did you have, maybe this is directed more towards Jay, did you have specific credit lines to transition to regenerative and organic practices when the farm transitioned to regenerative grains?
That's a great question. Our owners funded the whole thing. So Stonehouse Farm is a little unique in that it's owned by the Peggy McGrath Rockefeller Foundation. So the foundation itself financed the risk and what definitely was a cash flow deficit to transition the farm, which was, at that time, 2,000 acres of conventional grains to overnight, essentially, organic practices. Absolutely.
Yeah, amazing. That seems like a fast route when you have someone willing to just take on that the full transition risk.
Yeah, I don't recommend it. I think, doing it in a staged or phased process would be a little less risky.
Makes sense. Yeah. Beatrice, did you want to follow up on that? I see you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Thank you, Lenny. So Jay, how long did it take for you to have positive cash flow again after the transition?
We transitioned 10 years ago, Beatrice, and this year looks like it might be the first year.
Okay.
So 10 years.
Yeah, but it's worth it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm
Yes.
listening.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so we have a question in the Q&A, and then I'll come to you eventually, Karina, don't worry. For Robin. So Robin, how do you get enough nutrients in the soil given that you're not doing crop rotation with the perennial wheat? It sounds like, can the perennial wheat be organic, or do you need traditional fertilizers?
Yeah, so we're studying like the perennial wheat both like as an organic and conventional crop. Our breeding nurseries are all organic, but we work also with farmers that farm in a conventional manner. So the perennial wheat, yes, so it's perennial, but we are talking about like 2 growing seasons. So it's not like a forever crop like would be an oak tree or something like that. So it's still part of a crop rotation, like it would be maybe more of a hay crop. We can think different like types of perennial grasses. So it doesn't really. It's the good thing, and that was definitely intentional, is it's not a crop for which we have to create a completely new way of farming or a new way of harvesting or a new way of dealing with it. No, there's some adjustments for sure, but nothing that isn't within the skill set of any grain growers, no, really. We can use any type of nutrients that are already used within any grain operations, like being that organic or conventional. So, yeah.
Thanks. That was helpful to clarify.
Yeah.
Let's see. A question for Jay. What are your key crops for income? Since you have cover crops for a full year, it seems like you would have little or no income that year, which seems like it could be a challenge for farm financials. So yeah, I guess, do you even think about the farm financials on an annual basis or like over the full 4-year crop rotation?
When things aren't going well, yeah, you're looking to turn them around real quick. So it's both. You look at revenue each year, and if things are balanced and things are good, then it means that whole 4-year rotation is working it's got its own momentum. But if something's out of whack, you've got to figure out why you're not breaking even. And so, yeah, you really need to take a hard look at exactly the efficiency of all your acres. Right now, I don't have any fields that have a full year dedicated to cover crops. Like there are soil building years, like after we harvest wheat. I know that Kevin and Robin were saying that's when they turn their animals in to graze the wheat And for us, we've also, say we've undersown the perennial red clover. We just do nothing at that point on some of these big fields. They're harder to graze if they don't have fences. And we just let the red clover dominate, and it really will fix a lot of nitrogen. So it's probably then, from August until winter kill, it's a cover crop. And then in the spring, the following spring, it'll start growing early, and it'll get knee high almost in mid-May, and then we'll plow it down to plant corn. So it's like a shoulder season of cover cropping, and that's a real common use for how we employ cover crops. It wouldn't be for a full year, but it would be in addition.
And it's helpful to reference the crop rotation again, like that image that you showed at the beginning, because yeah, it's like not like every single one of your fields is in cover crop all at the same time. So hence
Right.
the rotation and the field plots that makes sense. And there was a related question for you that I just wanted to bring in. Oh, yeah, about cover crop rotations helping with the farm's financial flow. Are you starting to find or like any ways to market your cover crops? And I'm curious, like to feed in the yellow pea example here, like, do you feel promising that like new markets will develop to support some of the diversified crops you're growing?
I think, yeah, the yellow peas are a good example. I think there's a lot of demand for them in the food grade world. I haven't hooked up with any market yet, because the market's also really good in the animal feed world for soy-free feed. So that's a good example of a cover crop that's really adding value. And I guess all those diverse warm season crops too that we're planting after small grains, the sorghum Sudan and the millet and cowpea. I mean, we're grazing those, and we're selling beef. So that's a way that we're translating the cover crop into a cash crop as well. And there's another example too, which is through our local farm service agency office. I enrolled 250 acres of the farm up in the NRCS, so the National Resource Conservation District, I think it is. But so they're paying me now to grow cover crops because there's science that cover crops sequester carbon. And so instead of trying to go through the complicated process of selling carbon credits, through these climate smart farming initiatives, you can just enroll acres in planting cover crops. And then there's government assistance to compensate farmers for growing those cover crops. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is a good example of farm policy that could be expanded, I feel like, to support more of these practices happening that we know are good for soil health, and then have translations to human health further up the chain. Karina, let's go over to you to ask your question.
Thank you. So my background in vegetable production and indoor. So my question might be quite obvious, but anyway, I would like to voice it. So we're talking about regenerative grains, and therefore it's questions to all the panelists. How you define regenerative, and how can you prove that your crops are regenerative from 2 points of view? And first is land use, because we have to take into account the productivity and how much land we need to produce crop with seasonal rotation and cover crops, and in order to make sure that the land that we have under cultivation doesn't expand, right? And the second one is, Jay already mentioned it a little bit about carbon sequestration, but how is it going with the carbon content in your soil, so that's the question, is how you can characterize regenerativity of your practice.
We can start. I think we look at it as a holistic farm. We look at the regenerative process as a holistic farm activity. So the fact that we're 100 acres, only 25 of them are fields, we're looking at carbon sequestration in the trees, also in the fields with not plowing for 18 months. But we can't, with small grain production, we haven't found a way yet to get away from plowing at least every 18 months. And in some cases, when we have the fields that are not going fallow for that following year, we have to plow every September. So the one area where we can't totally cannot disturb the soil is in those field areas. So for us, the regenerative process is the whole farm itself, where how the animals are working with the farm and into the fields. And then the crops are a very small part of what the whole farm does. So that's how we look at it.
And one other thing I would add is also just looking at to the best of our abilities, closing loopholes. So we run a distillery, which is very inefficient for water use. And we have found ways we reuse the water for our animal needs. Ducks have a profound need of water. And so we integrate that into the ducks. We also use the straw after we harvest the crops. We use the straw for bedding for the animals. So for us, it's just trying to find ways to reduce waste as well. But I think the tenet of no plowing was something that we really we felt as though we had failed when we decided that we had to plow again. But we saw the results of not plowing, and it was
failure.
It was failure.
Yeah. So yeah, one year like I said earlier, it's pretty humid here. It's pretty wet. July is when we harvest the small grains, and like this year, it rained almost every day in July. So it becomes really complicated to get that crop in and still have it saved.
Totally. And I'm just curious if are you gathering data from soil samples to check in on like adjusting practices, or are you just getting a sense of holistic farm health from just like your observations of being out there?
We do soil samples every 3 years. So it's not an annual thing, but we track them every 3 years. One issue for us is the pH of the soil. We still, with rain, the soils are getting more acidic, which is an issue for us. So we found an organic quarry that we buy lime from in Massachusetts. We've limed the soils now, I think, twice in 9 years. So the other issue with the pH is that we also cause the pH to change a little bit just with our own practices. So when we pump out the mash tank, we spread that onto the fields, because that's all it is spent grain, or if we're doing apples or pears or currants or cranberry, whatever fruit we happen to be distilling, that also goes back onto the field. But the pH for all those things are much lower than the soil, so it changes the pH of the soil. So we have to watch the pH pretty closely.
Totally, that makes sense. Jay and Robin, do you want to weigh in on the regenerative nature of your practices?
Yeah, sure. I'll go. It's a great question. And I think for a lot of different definitions of what regenerative means, Karina, I think for me personally, I'm constantly trying to find a balance with the nutrient cycle on our farm. So I try and really look hard at any off-farm inputs we're bringing in, which would be chicken litter, which would be biological foliars, and I'm trying to be really honest about that. I mean, it's one thing if you drive a V8 truck and you say, this truck is regenerative. I don't have to replace any parts. It just runs on its own. But if you stop and think about every time you put gas in your truck and where the gas is coming from and the carbon footprint that is tied up in that gallon of gas, it's a whole different conversation. So I think it's really important for all of us to look at our practices, and whether or not you're a 10,000 acre grain farm in the Midwest or Stonehouse Grain, 2,000 acres in the Hudson Valley, how are you balancing your nutrient checkbook on your farm? Is it a deficit? Is it a surplus, or is it balanced? And I think if I could get this farm into a balanced nutrient flow, it would mean that it is feeding itself, that the crops that we're growing in a rotation are feeding the next crop, which are feeding the next crop. And incorporating livestock in there is really important for the carbon cycle. I can tell you that we pull soil tests on every field every fall. And we've gone back 7 years of data on this farm so far. And what we see is when we're growing grains, our annual grains are depleting the soil. But then when we go back into perennial cover crops like clovers and grass hay, or even some of these big biomass warm season crops, we start to build the soil back really quickly. And we build it up, and we'll get 30 to 35,000 pounds of carbon per acre in these what basically are the lay rotation of these hay fields. And then we've built up that energy in the organic matter, and then when we plow that sod back down to grow grain, it starts to cycle over again. So it's depending on when you look at the field in the rotation. Sometimes it looks good, sometimes it looks bad, but in that whole kind of like 5 to 7 year rotation of grains and grass, hay, pasture back into grains, we're building soil. It's a positive trend line is what we're seeing 10 years into organic transition.
Thanks for sharing that, Jay. And I think that's such a really important note to underscore that carbon is constantly cycling. So even as we're thinking about like stuffing it back into the ground in larger quantities for climate mitigation, understanding the biological carbon cycling is really important, and no place is exactly the same. Like you might have a forest ecosystem with like 10% soil organic carbon, and it's stable, it's not changing. So you're not getting, carbon sequestration per se, but we don't want to disturb that. And then you might have farming systems where you're only releasing carbon to the atmosphere and it's running a complete deficit, or you might have farming systems in balance, or even like on net slightly accumulating carbon in the soils over time. So I think that's just an important reflection to bring to these conversations. Robin, sorry if you have anything more to add.
Thank you. So I think that the question of the definition in the regenerative, let's say, narrative is a really important one. From an operational perspective, I totally agree with Jay, Robin, and Kevin. And what I feel we can sum up is like the regenerative approach to agriculture could be considered to be a dynamic way of like looking at the consequences of farming practices and defining what is a positive consequences or what is a negative consequence, and what should we try to address in the future. Now, for example, just a common example of regenerative practices, or conversation, they often revolve around tillage. Should we till or should we not till? And in some areas, tillage has been proven to be highly problematic, for reasons like related to soil erosion by like wind erosion or water erosion, but it's highly context dependent. So I think it's really important to recognize that we cannot say like a priori tillage is horrible everywhere and all the time. So it's more complex than that kind of black and white answer. So in this sense, I agree in this perspective that regenerative as a kind of a context-specific definition. From an institutional perspective, however, if we have to think about regenerative agriculture in the framework of a nationwide effort to tackle climate change and public health needs, it's the lack of a univocal definition is a big issue and potential problem in the future and going forward. So because, for example, as I said, we can have like process-based definitions. So we can say that regenerative agriculture is a form of agriculture that doesn't use tillage or reduce tillage and on and on. Or an outcome-based approach. So regenerative agriculture allows us to sequester carbon through our agricultural practices, or a mixture of the two. But in the end, the fact that at the moment, there isn't like something like we have for organic agriculture, that we all can exactly know what organic agriculture means because there's a law that defines that. And so we can all kind of understand what we shall or shall not do, to be qualified to be organic farmers or to produce organic products. So this can create quite a bit of confusion and open the opportunities for like less well-intentioned actors, probably, in the arena. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks for weighing in on that, Robin. And I feel like there are definitely places in the US that are trying to adopt and standardize and kind of socialize definitions of regenerative agriculture. Regenerative Organic Alliance and Regenerative Organic Certified is probably the farthest along that I'm aware of, but it's definitely still being contested and worked through. So we can provide more resources on the status of that conversation for anyone interested. We can get through two more quick questions, but with the remaining time that we have. One is for you, Jay. Do you think farms growing grains for animal feed could also grow and market food grade grains? How different is it? Are they different varieties, or is it mostly processing? Yeah, I'll let you weigh in on that.
Okay, I think it's market. I think there's just so many huge like poultry processors and like, beef feedlots that are really hungry for all this animal feed protein. But that is what so many acres are dedicated toward growing. But if we change the way we eat and we change the way we create markets for food grade plant-based protein, there's no reason farmers wouldn't switch, and it would probably be better, no doubt, for the environment. As we pointed out, or as I was mentioning, soybeans take all year to grow. They're not that big of a biomass crop. They only photosynthesize like at peak photosynthesis for 2 months out of the entire year. Corn is very similar, grows very fast, and it's at peak photosynthesis, for 2 months out of the year as well until it starts to senesce and die down. So if we had more of a diverse crop rotation that was growing food grade grains like those peas and wheat, there would just be a lot more green cover on the soils that you'd see from, a satellite, which would be great for the earth.
Amazing. Yeah, good points. So, okay, last two that I can see, at least for now. In your all's view, is it essential to have on-farm value-added product for small and mid-sized grain farms? Or is there a way for these types of non-industrial sized farms to achieve profitability without a product like feed or spirits?
From our side, we're too small to ever make a living on 25 acres of small grain. There's no chance. So basically 660 pounds of wheat or rye milled produces for us around 50 liters of alcohol at 84%, which would translate into, I have to do some math. Sorry, I can't do it in my head. But basically that would be that's almost 700 bottles of whiskey. So it would be, we can sell that at $50 or $60 a bottle, as opposed to what the 30 cents a pound for, which is what the going rate is for certified organic wheat on the open market. So for us, the only way to do it is to have a value-added product, but that's just because of our size.
Okay, we'll leave that one just there for now. And then last one, if anyone wants to weigh in before we close out, is just what would be some advice you would give someone starting out on the same journey into growing regenerative grains? Any closing pieces of wisdom?
I would weigh in and say align yourself with farm and get some hands-on practical experience, and maybe work with a conventional farm as well, just so that you're not logged down in theory and bias. I think there's, especially with grain, it's complicated, it's nuanced, and I think it's important to see kind of all sides. Before I embarked on raising ducks and chickens, I worked on a farm. I processed them. I kind of really got my hands dirty, and that was invaluable to me. So I think just practical application would be my advice. Like, find someone and maybe donate some time to doing it.
I would say also be willing to pivot quickly, because it's, no matter what your business plan may say, it almost always never works out the way you think it's going to work out. So be willing to change and adjust and adapt and sometimes put on the brakes. We kind of had a little fortune in the fact that we didn't have any money, so it gave us time as we were trying to get a small business administration loan to do what we wanted to do. It gave us like time on the farm to practice things, try different things. Observe, live with the land for a little bit longer period of time. It changed the way we wanted to do what we ended up doing. So I think that's important as well.
Yeah, I'll ditto what Robin and Kevin say. Find a mentor and just really just explore that mentor relationship and respond to what excites you about growing grains, if that's what you're into, and not, and don't be afraid to change your plan too. If it's not production that it turns out you love doing, maybe it's marketing, or maybe it's starting that value added mill. But there are just so many entry points into the grain world.
There really are.
Yeah, I agree with that, and like perhaps there could be like an opportunity. For example, here where we are located, the Skagit Valley is not a major grain growing area, but there's still a lot of wheat and barley and rye. But there's also 80 different crops growing. While maybe potatoes or tulips might be the focus of most farmers here, they still have to grow barley and wheat for their crop rotations. And so my professor, Stephen Jones, was able to kind of further develop like grain opportunities here by having, like, fostering like conversation about having like a malting house, a flour mill now are running here in the valley. And so while that is not let's say there could be unexpected opportunities just by doing like novel things, novel approaches to farming in areas that grains are not exactly the focus of most operations.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Thank you all for weighing in on that. And thanks for everyone for your time and being here and for your great questions. We'll close things out for today with a big thank you to our speakers. And look forward to continuing these conversations next week and into the future. And if you need any follow-up connections or follow-up questions that didn't get answered, feel free to reach out to me and I will connect you for those follow-ups. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.